Well, thanks for having me, Alex. Appreciate the time. And I just thought I would just talk about my career path. And my career path, I think, is really embedded in career development, one of the topics we will dive into more as we go on. So I personally was very assertive in managing my career path as I started with this company called Becton Dickinson out of college. And I worked for BD for 32 years. And in 32 years, I had 15 different positions. So I had a lot of different change, a lot of movement. I stepped into some positions where I was managing people who I was making more money than. And I showed, it was early in my career. So I showed professional composure by not complaining about somebody having more money than me, because the long-term benefits for me, my salary and my compensation would be rewarded. And so I worked not only 32 years in 15 different positions, I also had the opportunity to work in many geographical areas. I moved to Singapore and I managed the Pacific Rim business there very early in my career. And
What year was that, Bob? What kind of era?
what year was that? Let's see. I started my career in 83. So it was like 1990 when I went to Singapore.
Okay.
And I had advanced. So in my first 10 years my first 5 years with the company, I had 10 different positions, all
Wow.
in the sales area. And then I went to be a business director, which was the first time I moved away from just that sales path and marketing path.
Sure. So when you become a business director, is that where they start to give you P&L responsibility, or how did the responsibilities change in that type of role?
Yeah. So that was my first P&L role that I had. It was a small business at that time. We had no business penetration really in the Asian markets. So it was really about trying to look for accelerated growth. It was only when I got there, $7 million in revenues, and we had about 7 people across all of those countries and regions.
Wow.
Uh, by the time I left 3 years later, we had advanced to about $36 million in business, and we had about 100 employees across the region. And that was in 3.5, 4 years.
Sure. And I think something which is always interesting, Bob, is when we're looking back at careers, we have to appreciate that maybe the Becton Dickinson that we know today was not the Becton Dickinson of then, right? So there was probably a lot of immaturity in the systems, in the processes. So speak to me a little bit about what was that situation? How mature were those things? And was it like going into a startup? Where were the challenges? Because it sounds exciting, and it sounds, if you had all the tools and everything else and all the money in the world, this just sounds like the greatest gig on earth. But I have a feeling it was probably a little trickier than that.
Oh, it was very much like a startup. And plus you had the cultural differences of all the different markets you were working with, from the Australian markets, which were more Western in their thinking, to China, where we had no people, no business in China at the time I had been over there. So lots of challenges, and even just the dynamics of working together as a team. We're going to talk a little bit about team management. The Koreans didn't want to work with the Taiwanese, and it just created lots of barriers. And I used a team approach in pulling them all together. And we did a lot of what we called strategic profiles, where we took each country, came in, originally the 7 leaders, we would do a whole strategic profile process, which is a 2 or 3 day process that really laid out the game plans and the requirements that we needed to meet in each of the individual countries, as well as the region, which I was responsible for.
Absolutely. And I would imagine, looking back on this, must seem like quite a formative thing that you went through, because from what I'm hearing, you're working cross-culturally, right? In cultures which are not your expertise, right? You didn't grow up in Taiwan or China or something like that. So that means that there's got to be a certain level of agility. You've then also inherited more of a broad spectrum for the business. So you've got that P&L understanding and all that. So when we think about this particular role, I'm sure that when it came up and someone said, "Hey, Bob, do you go to Singapore?" There was a bit of trepidation, but as you said, you put yourself forward. And it sounds like that may have been somewhat on the belief that someone had said, "We think you can do this, Bob." I'm not sure whether you thought you could do this. So let's maybe start with that. Did you go into it with supreme confidence, or was there
absolutely? I went into this with a deer in headlights. Absolutely. So I had a strong mentor. gentleman who asked me to go to Singapore. I had worked for, he was the sales manager and then had advanced into different roles. And it was very much, it was development for me to move me out of that sales role and give me that broader management perspective. But it was also, I didn't have a lot of the skills that were required. Strategic planning, all of a sudden I've got this assignment. I'm there for 3 months. Okay, the honeymoon's over. It's time to get to work. What's the strategy? What's the plan? And so there was other business segment leaders there who I was able to work with, where I got their guidance and they gave me insight. The gentleman that sent me over there would help me understanding all the different tools that I needed and the processes that I needed to follow to try to put these plans together. So it was a huge learning experience for me. And it was described as a learning assignment. And I would go there and this would move me in the general management path, but it was a need for the company and it was a need for me. And it was like, the only guarantee they gave me was that they would repatriate me back into the U.S. And you won't, the job you're in won't be available 3.5 years from now. They might not have a job for me. And I was young. I talked to my wife. We had a young daughter at the time and we said, we got nothing to lose. Let's go give this a try. And it was the best decision for my career. That was the fork in the road for me in my career.
For sure. So if we take a step back from that role, obviously you're moving through the sales organization within BD. Had there been a sit down conversation with your line manager on what did you want to be when you grew up? Or was it more of an organic thing that was driven by your mentor? Was there always a plan?
So the answer to that is no. At the time we went through that, there was no big plan. I don't think the company really was steering towards that career path orientation. That came later in Becton Dickinson. So it was my mentor that he was leading the total business. He was the president of the business segment and he had a need and he felt that I could achieve that. He had confidence in me. So it was a two-way street. I think as a result, it was just talking about how this would help your career, why this would potentially move you in a different direction by having this experience. And worst comes to worst, you come back and go back into the sales organization or you leave the company. A lot of the expats didn't repatriate and ended up moving someplace else. So
sure. I think you put a really interesting point in there, Bob, which is an almost what's the worst that can happen, right? Which is the worst that can happen is I go do the job that I was doing before. And, yes. And so to actually, I think a lot of people talk themselves out of these moves because they're, what happens if I fail?
Yeah. It was also for me, I didn't look at it as I would fail, but I did look at it as there was nobody else at that point in time to go to Singapore. No one wanted international assignments. It was unheard of at that point in time. Now today, international business, people are trying to move all around the world. So for me, it was like, let's take this role on. No one else is doing it. So it's going to give me a competitive advantage in my career because I'm going to have this exposure and experience. And that did materialize then as my career progressed.
Absolutely.
So,
so it sounds like there were transferable skills on the way out, right? I think maybe, and if we think from a commercial perspective, being able to maybe penetrate markets, generate revenue, understand the levers and pulleys, the levers and pulleys for the people who still think I'm British, and being able to manipulate those to drive the revenue. So I think that the company clearly had confidence there. I guess what's also interesting is coming off of this assignment and going back to the US, now with this world view, how did that change things?
Yeah,
because that could be difficult in itself.
Yeah, my step back was first off, we were there 3.5 years. And the step back into the company, there wasn't an assignment. So they created a position for me. And basically the position they created, they made me I don't know if at that point, at that point, I think they moved me up to a vice president. I was a vice president of global expansion. So the things that I was able to do with the team in Asia were lacking in other developing markets. So I became a global expansion leader. So I went back to the US, but I was still working and managing the Asia Pacific team. And then I started to get the EMA responsibility as well, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So those developing markets, let's try to replicate what we did in Asia in those markets. And I just So that was a natural progression for me and a natural need for the company. So it worked out. And again, they created that position for me. And it was funny that I had been back from a personal standpoint. My wife was like, oh, I couldn't do more than 3 years. And then we got back, we were home about 6 months, and she goes, why'd we leave so soon? Why don't we, then you go on another international assignment. And then I planted the bug in my boss on, this is great. I like this role. I think I did that for another 3 years, that global expansion role. And then it led me to going to Europe and managing the European business, which
Okay.
was probably more of a challenge in the Asian market because I think those markets were so much more established, and they were bigger base of business. And it was like, why is this American coming in to try to tell us how to run things in Europe, which was, the primary countries in Europe that we had worked across.
Sure. So when you think about obviously the Singapore assignment or your European assignments, what is it that maybe underpinned your success? Because you obviously had success in both, and it sounds like there were slightly different challenges, maybe more cultural resistance in Europe or something like that, but you still managed to overcome, Bob, and you still, hey, just to get the job done, as it were. So what really started to form the base of your approach and pillars? Because this, I think, goes back to our topic of career development, but
Yes.
recognizing that you're going to develop skills, you're going to take them with you on the journey. I think it also, if we then were to forecast, and we'll talk about this later, you becoming a CEO, I would imagine a lot of these skills have cropped up again and again. Let's maybe think about this European side and
Yeah.
Singapore side. So what were the consistent things that have started to really be the tools in your toolkit that are the most used?
Yeah. So I'll start off with, I think the reason they asked me to go to Singapore was just my interpersonal style. I also, I was always very calm and never really got alarmed at things. I interpersonally could connect, but I was very business oriented. My mannerisms and my style was the reason they sent me to Singapore, rather than, especially we worked at BD in matrix management. So it was always two bosses. It was me as the business head and then the regional head, always having that ability to work through those conflicts that would come up. I want to do it this way, so let's do it that way. And that's where the learning of the tools that really helped me be successful. The profiling tool was just coming in 3 or 4 days, and a 3-day process where you would bring in all the managers and the country leaders, and you would work through what the goals were and how you were going to get that done. They sent me to classes on how to facilitate those meetings. They taught me the different processes that we could use to go through and get all the questions developed. And it connected to voice of the customer skills, was really going out and taking the voice of the customer and then managing through that. So that was all huge learning that carried me. Even I've used those skills throughout my whole career. I still use some of I guess it was a little bit later on. It was probably in the year 2000 when I went to a BD sponsored program at American University where they talked to us about team development and the team process skills that we use there. So it was clearly a combination of assignments, educational background. Went to Singapore, was project development. I went to project development school at Singapore University to really understand how do you manage the projects and how do you keep the focus on the tasks.
And that's interesting, Bob, because it sounds like there was not only maybe a library of tools that BD had, because it's a big company, people have obviously done these things before, but it sounds like you were also driving your own development or supplementing your own development using external sources and that side of things.
Yes, and I think it was at a combination of the career. So the review process was really talking about your development and what were the things that you needed to enhance your success or your career, and then looking for opportunities to develop them. So going to the Singapore University was just, I didn't have those project management skills, and let's go find something in the area that's comprehensive. It wasn't a short-term program. It was three or 4 month program that was routine. So, and just take each skill as we needed. Strategic planning. I never felt the strength was strategy and strategy development. And I would say through my career, it became almost second nature. I think even the process that we learned with this profiling process and the tool set there, when I first became the CEO, not to jump that far ahead, but when I first became the CEO at SynergEyes, I did the profile session with the board to figure out, okay, here I am in this job. What do you want? What does the board really want this company to be? And that rolled right into my planning and activities and the things we did at SynergEyes for my 5 years that I was the CEO.
Yeah. So I think there are maybe a couple of things that I did, right? One is gap analysis, really, right? Where am I now? Where do I need to get to? And how on earth do I develop what I need in order to get there? And it sounds like maybe the big company environment, they had structures for that. They were good at highlighting some of those things. Obviously, it's driven by your appetite, right?
Yeah.
To actually go through the pain of learning and change and that side of things. And I'm really thinking about these building blocks that you experienced that have maybe informed your approach as you've gone through your career. There are maybe two other things that I want us to talk about, and I move us towards maybe talking about how these have translated into behaviors that you saw modeled, into you modeling those behaviors for others, right? And developing teams which are underneath you. But the thing that I want to ask first is, when you left Becton Dickinson, I think you went to the Cooper companies and then you went to SynergEyes. So the Cooper companies at the time, how big was that company in comparison to Becton Dickinson?
Business size of Cooper Vision was about the same size of the business segment that I was working in. It was about $1 billion business when I had left. Now, I was in Cooper Vision. Yeah. Did I say SynergEyes? In Cooper Vision, it was about the same size. But I managed the North American business, and the North American business there was probably about $600 million in sales. And, I was only there 13 months. So I fell out of that transition. They went through and acquired a major company. They spent $1.2 billion to acquire a company in the contact lens space. And I was on the outside looking in because I didn't have the contact lens experience when I went there. And they decided because of that major investment, they wanted somebody to run that business. So I was only there 13 months, Ledge. I always felt in a lot of the things I did, the first year was always chaos. You were just trying to get a handle on things and figure out who's going to help, what you really needed. The second year was you started to get comfortable and you started to really get some momentum. And then by the third year, I always felt that I was mastering my assignments and really had control of the business. And that a generalization, but I'd say through most of the things I did, that was the way it happened, the way it would fall out. So I was just in that chaos stage for my time at Cooper Vision.
Yeah. And I think the reason why I bring it up is because I see it as a really interesting stepping stone into going into SynergEyes. And sometimes there's a lot of bias from companies, especially if they're smaller companies, saying, we don't want to hire this Fortune 100 person because they've got all these systems, they've got all this process. There's a perception you have unlimited budgets. We all know that's not true, but the perception is there. And I think it's also important for leaders to recognize that sometimes coming out of a larger company, it's going to be a difficult experience because you go to reach for something and it's not there.
Yeah, and Alex, so that's absolutely going big company to small company is a major transition. It's a different mindset. Process is really locked down and it's non-existent in the other. So I would, first of all, to get to SynergEyes, I did have 17 interviews to get into that small company. So they were really, I don't think they were sure about that because I was a big company guy.
Right.
But I always positioned it that I worked for a big company, but I was always in those smaller role assignments, a Singapore assignment. That was like a startup company. It was a startup company. We expanded business into 4 or 5 different countries during my time there. So, it was so I could make that connection. Same thing when I went to the European role, the EMA portion of that. They were all small businesses and it was a lot of trial and error processes. We had to try to connect into the big BD systems, but there was resistance to it. There was pushback. Why do we need that? There was lots of challenges in that. So I think as I presented myself, and after I left, when I was leaving CooperVision, I wanted to try the small company. And that's really all I looked for. And I was fortunate. I did find that position only 6 weeks after I had left CooperVision, and I think I was able to make that transition to the small company because a lot of my career was in a big company, mom and dad looking over my shoulder, but I had my own small little pot to work with. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this starts to bring us, Bob, now you coming in with lots of experiences. And again, what we said earlier, right? The modeling of behaviors that you'd seen in these mature companies, right? It's not just about size, it is about maturity. I know there are plenty of big companies that don't have maturity with some of these systems. So you're then operating in this smaller entity, and there's an argument to be made that dollars in a smaller company have to work harder than they do in a bigger company. Or put a different way, if a smaller company makes a mistake, it could be the death of the company. Whereas Becton Dickinson makes a mistake, depending on the size, but probably not the death of the company.
No,
right? So there's a lot more riding on those dollars and what we do. So talk to me a little bit about what were you able to take with you? And we touched on this on our prep call, which is around teams. And one thing which just screams out from your career, Bob, is you're good at building them. And they seem to work very well. And I'm sure it wasn't easy. But what's behind that? Like, how did you start to understand maybe even what is needed? And then the other thing, which is what's the right blend of people in order to get the best team? Because I've heard many stories time and time again from different leaders. It's not just about hiring the smartest people you can find who are all technical experts, because if they can't work together, it's a disaster. So talk to me about some of that, your philosophies behind that, because that, I think, is a huge part of career development when we talk about leadership development and getting really good at creating these groups.
Yeah, I think so. To me, it takes teamwork to get things accomplished, and bringing that into the small company, there was not a team environment going into the small company. I also, the learning and development, I brought in training to the managers. So when I was first appointed to the CEO position at SynergEyes, I brought in development first. It was like, let's get everybody on my management team. We had 20 managers all representing different functions, and get them all on the same page of what we're trying to accomplish. So the profiling processing that I had learned was a great tool. They had never been through that. It really helped get the minds together. There was resistance to it. We wanted to we brought in an external company it was a 12-month program. Every month they came in and ran a 2 or 3 hour, I think it was a 4-hour program once a month on all of the different elements of that a business leader looks for in his management team: communication, team building. So every month was a different focus, and a lot of resistance, a lot of why do we have to do this, and people not showing up and trying to track them down and get into the learning sessions initially. At the end of the 12 or 14 months, we missed a couple of months. At the end of that time, the managers were brought in. It created this common language. So when we would talk about things, everyone had understanding. So the development aspect of that really helped the mechanics of the business move forward. And I think you can't run a company without people are the greatest assets, and getting everyone on board on that you could see the resistance. Have conversations with some of the folks even today, and they just talk about, they thought I was a crazy guy coming in with, why are we bringing this in and spending all this money and all this time with this company called Crestcom doing this training? I think it created that foundation for teamwork. It was really and it is about team. And in all of my positions, even when I was in the Asia market, it was about the team and getting the folks working together. And so how do you do that? I used the Drexel CBIT, very old team model that was out there. And I learned that in that American University program. That's where I first learned the team model. And it was just making sure you're getting the team together. You're building why they're there first. Why am I on this team? What's my contribution? What do I have to try to achieve? And just getting that understanding and the common language, I think, is a critical foundation to some of the success that I had.
Absolutely.
I was in it. We were in it together. It's your problems are my problems. So let's not hide anything. Let's get everything in the open. I think in the smaller company, quality was a big issue when I got there. They didn't want to talk about quality. Quality wasn't manufacturing's problem or engineering problem, but it was. And we would get all of those issues surfaced, and we would put corrective action plans in place. And one of our values at SynergEyes became quality is everybody's business. It's eat something, say something.
It's very funny you say that, because I think Pat Yang said something very similar at Genentech.
Yeah. Well, I can't take credit for that. That was BD, was quality from the first time I got there. They were quality oriented right from their 1800 days. It was about quality. I grew up in an environment where quality was critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to think about helping this team develop, Bob, as well, because I'm sure you went in, you looked at who was there. I'm sure you started to work out, okay, here are my rock stars. Here are the people that, well, they're kind of in the middle. Here are the people that, wow, I'm not so sure they're going to make it. So how did you start to, I guess, address those things? And again, it's about having the right people on the bus. So
Yeah,
what did that look like as well?
About having the right people on the bus. And so there was a couple of tools that I would carry through that we put in place. One is a P by P, performance and potential. So it's looking at all of the employees. Every manager had to look at their employees and talk about what are their strengths and what are their areas of weakness. And is their performance excellent, or does it need improvement? Are they high potential, or are they just need development? So let's get that aspect. And that took us a while to get that model embedded, because I think the first time we got it, everyone was excellent in their performance and everyone was going to be high performing. So we had to really get calibration with the managers, and you had to get the managers to be realistic as they talk to their employees. They needed to give them the details. They have those crucial conversations that you're not good in this area. We need to develop this, but here's your strengths, and let's work towards your strengths. So we had to go through that process. So we used the P by P. We brought that in. And then, to get to your other point of the question, there was the biggest thing was getting the negative voice out of my management team. So there was a few individuals that just were disruptors, and we had to, and I would never act quickly on somebody. I always gave them the benefit and the chance to make changes once I brought those challenges awareness to them. But unfortunately, there was 3 disruptors that once I was able to remove them from the team, we really started to really harmonize and get a lot of work done. So it's having the crucial conversations, letting people know where they stand, and giving them a fair amount of time to change their performance and fix the behaviors, or take action. So that was a key. And then it was not only, those were 3 direct reports to me, which I think set the stage for other managers to try to take care of shortcomings and weaknesses in their functional areas. So again, it starts at the top. So if you model it at the top, people will follow along. So
for sure. And then in terms of the training program and that side of things as well, what level did that start at? Because was it just your direct reports, or was it 2 levels down? Or?
So it was, no. So the 20 people were not all my direct reports. I think my direct reports, I really only had about 6 or 7 direct reports. And then it was anyone that was managing people in the organization, and a few supervisors that we included, and even a couple of people who we brought into it. So the 20 were that high potential category.
Yeah.
They were associates working in the company, but they had that high potential. So we included them in the process.
Yeah, for sure.
In that development process. So they went through the classes with us.
Yeah. So when you now maybe are approached by someone starting their career journey, maybe starting their management journey, Bob, how do you guide them? because you obviously have had great success adding these additional skills, bringing people through and getting to the level of CEO, right? And if you ask a lot of people at the beginning, sometimes they say, I want to be a CEO. I'm not sure they truly understand what being a CEO is. You got there. So what would you pass on to these individuals coming through? And, times have changed. As you said, international business has changed as well. So what do you think that people really need to focus in on and develop?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think one of the things that I talked to and I embraced, I looked for the employees who wanted to advance their careers. But I also think even stepping back to the hiring process, it's like you got to hire people you got to look at those people who want to advance their career. But you also need to have those employees that I want to be a solid contributor. I want to learn day to day, but I don't want those upward responsibilities. So I think you have to have a good balance in your company with that. And I would encourage, and I worked with a lot of people through my career in trying to help them advance their career. And one of the things that I felt was an important tool was management without authority. It's how do you lead when you're not the boss. So really getting people, and I had in that matrix management, a lot of times I had positions I was leading, but I wasn't the boss. And so how do you influence that? And there was a woman, Mary Bragg, who had some great books and tool sets out around managing influence without authority was really her forte, and just trying to learn techniques to get people to follow along. And it does fall back to just the team bonding, the common goals on where you want to get to. When you get to the root of influencing, that is it. But it's really then recognizing the different styles that people bring to it. Those highly aggressive and people who are assertive, and versus those that sit back, have a lot of knowledge, but are not willing to get their voice out there. So how do you get that voice out, and how do you silence some of those people that always have something to say? That's a skill. I don't know if I was great at it, but I tried to get at some level of balance. I don't completely balance, but I got some level of balance when I did it. And I would teach people that, talk about that.
So it's funny because it goes back to facilitation. When we started with that, and maybe some of that early training in BD in Singapore of how to facilitate between disparate groups of people with very differing ideas and maybe backgrounds and everything else. And it sounds like that is something which has been a common theme.
Yeah, absolutely. The facilitation process was key for me. And I think it was key for the way BD ran their company. Facilitation was a major process. So learning that early in my career was critical. Those profile sessions where you bring in 2 or 3 days, you bring in people in and just getting common voice, but then making sure you leave with some structure around that. So I think mostly everything I learned in different tool sets were all about an engineer. We used a tool called market design product definition. And it was a consultant that came in, and it was about, we're going out, we talk to the customer. You've got your customer, you got a marketing person, you got a salesperson, you got an engineering person, and a project-oriented person. The customer is talking to all of us at the same time, but we're all hearing something different. And they're all taking away different things. So how do you bring that collective voice together? And that's what the profile and the engagement process was for me. So not only it was the big 4-day sessions, but it was individual sessions, really just trying to get the individual thoughts together to really say, what does that truly mean?
Yeah. And it sounds,
then you're working towards a common goal.
Yeah. And it sounds like a fairly classic change management process where you're speaking to all of the individuals, and then synthesizing all the information together, playing it back to the individuals, and discussing maybe the playback, and getting people to say, yeah, you know what, I recognize my input or something like that. I understand. And then using that as a key driver. But were there other parts to it as well? Because
I think it's that, but it's also that when you come out with the final plan or the final actions that you're going to put forward, everyone in there, it's not exactly what they said, but they can see a piece of what they contributed coming out of me. So that's, to me, that was the key to the buy-in. People having their input, and part of that outcome process that you would put in place they could see their voice, the things they made in that action plan. So now that helps with the buy-ins. Is it successful all the time? No. And then you got to manage to that. But I think for me, that was in my style. Again, I went into every one of these things. I don't know what to do. Yeah, you made me the CEO or I was the general manager of a different business. I don't know what to do. You're closer to the customer. You're closer to the manufacturing operation. So let's get your voice together. And I think that is that style that I had. And the reason they sent me to Singapore is I don't know. I don't have images. So let's figure it out. And once we figure it out, we're all going in the same direction and we agree on that direction. I think that's when success comes.
It's interesting because it's collaboration around the problem and on the problem, not fighting each other, but fighting the problem. And I think maybe there was another thing that you mentioned earlier, and it was inferred, which is this idea of being able to get things out there, right? And I think all leaders will say that safety forms the base for everything, right? If someone's got a piece of knowledge or a problem or a question or can see something which is going to sink the company, then you'd much rather they brought it to the forefront opposed to sat on it or something like that. So
Sure.
that safety pieces as well, Bob, that's a huge element that people need to think about developing. I'm not sure all of us are good at it, to be honest, to begin with. So was there any guidance in that? Because I'm also thinking that in modern leadership terms, you hear the word psychological safety like every other day, but I know that in the 90s or things like that, it wasn't there, or it wasn't thought of in the same way.
Yeah. And again, so the facilitation process has so much breakout into you put a problem on the board and you all recognize what it is, but you break into the smaller pieces. And that's where I think you begin to get that silent voice. People are not going to voice it in front of 20 people. But when they get into their groups of 2 or 3, their voice is heard more often than not. And then they also don't feel like I'm not going to call the baby ugly in the middle of 20 people. But if I say it in a small group and that small group now is bringing that back, it's not me, Bob, that brought the baby's ugly to the table. It's the group that brought it there. And no one really knows who it is. So you're able to get that silent voice out, which it's all built, to me, it's built into that whole process. And I guess I was very process oriented. That was probably one of my strengths, and I hope that I didn't over process things, but it was how I would get things done. And I did see the change at SynergEyes from a small company and moving a whole management team on. I have seen the change. And even at BD, we had a whole business process redesign back, I think it was in the 2000 timeframe. We were only hitting about 50% of our milestones at the R&D level at that time. And we brought in this business process redesign, which included this market design product development process, which got the common voices together. And we moved from a 50% rate to 85% of milestones being delivered on time. That helped accelerate product development, getting things out the door, reducing costs. It had big P&L impact from that result.
So when you think about large enterprises, Fortune 100s and that side of things, it sounds like the challenge there in many ways is the same as a small company, which is silos not talking to each other, people not working together, a lack of common language, a lack of agreement maybe on the goals. And the thing which has really accelerated your career is being able to solve those challenges, which is...
I would agree with that, because I do think when you really get into it, the big silos in the company, they were probably harder to break down. And again, as I take my career at BD, I was not in the big silos. I was in the smaller silos. And eventually, till the end, at the end of my career at BD, my end of my time there, I was working at the higher level, but it was still making sure that voice was getting to the table and trying to act on it. How do you change it?
Yeah. And I guess something which is also an element that people are not necessarily prepared for when they go into smaller companies and they go into more senior level positions is working with the board and knowing how to. Mm-hmm. So in terms of developing some of those skills and that side of things, Bob, how was that shift? And ultimately, if you think about working with boards, What do you think, if you could just offer grains of advice, think about this now, you'll be grateful in 20 years' time. What does that look like?
That's a good question. The board that I at SynergEyes, they were all the venture capitalists. They all had a stake in it and a piece in it. They all came from different backgrounds and they all had their own voice and opinion of how things should be done. But I was offered the position in mid-July, and the end of July, I was running a profile session with that board. I used the techniques and the things that we did. I brought them in for 2 or 3 days. They had never done anything like that at SynergEyes. So I don't know if they had other experience with it. And we put the problems that we had them talk about the problems. We took some voice of the customer in, so they heard some of the comments from the customer. We sat together, and from that, they gave me what I called their core objectives. And then I took their core, what were forget how many things we had, 4 or 5 things that they wanted accomplished in the next 3 years. And then we went to work with a management team to say, here's what the board is looking for. This is what we have to try to achieve. So now how do we do it? And then we basically reported back on that for my time as CEO. We made good progress towards those goals and objectives in my first 3 years. And then my last 2 years was all about, okay, they were ready to get out. So how do we maximize the value and sell the company off? And that was part of the long-term plans. Let's fix the quality problem. Let's get that taken care of. We operated in the negative. It was constantly looking for investment to pay the bills. We were able to get to break even and net profit, which was one of the objectives, improve the product performance, launch a new product, and then get some momentum going so that we'd be more attractive for the sale of the company. So follow those steps.
Yeah, fantastic. And we've referred to this profiling exercise that's come up again and again in your career. Is that something which is available for others to see? Is it just within the archives of BD, or have you found anything similar to it?
I think because I've been using it, you can definitely find it elsewhere. There's tools out there. There's a simplified process of it is the Grove. I used to use the Grove tools, Grove International, and they have about 20 different slides that you can work through. It's all about this facilitation process. So I think I used that later on in my career compared to the more complicated BD process that was out there. So there's definitely tools out there. So if you just look at profiling, Googling profile, Grove they were more elementary, I would say, their tools, but they were very effective. They got to all the talking points. They had great models on how they connect. And there's probably different 12 to 20 different slide sets that you would work through. And each of those were a discussion and a takeaway. And it comes away with we would leave those meetings with the 5 bold steps. And so by the end of my career as SynergEyes, they kept hearing all about the 5 bold steps. So what are the 5 bold steps forward? And most everything would let you would going to be crazy, but you drive towards them.
Yeah. And I think it's also very interesting because there's how do you make strategy tangible, right? That's, I think, a lot of challenge. Anyone can, I think, do a market analysis and start to zero in. Where should we focus? What does this look like? But to convert it to action and to then drive accountability and have people do that.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's the crux of it as well.
Well, that's why I think, so I always felt that I was very novice in my strategic thinking capability. And it was the tool sets that really helped to get the thing. It's simplified strategy. It's voice of the customer. It's what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? How do you put a plan together and then follow it? So when you go through this thinking where I didn't think I was good at strategy, I felt I was good at following all the pieces and then then once you have the plan set, with anything, you have to monitor and report, on the results. And you can't, you're hitting it or you're not hitting it. And yes, there's some making progress, but you've got to be candid in saying you're not hitting that objective. So how do we get to it? What's missing? What are the steps to get there? And modify and adapt if you need to.
Sure. And it sounds like that's part of the facilitation process as well. Where people are agreeing on the metrics which are going to be used to measure success.
Yeah.
And quite happy to say, if we hit this, we are being successful.
And that was going to SynergEyes. That was exactly, we tried to roll down the objectives down to the employee. What's the guy on the line? What's his job? How does it connect to that function's objectives and how do those function objectives tie to what we're trying to get done. So everyone felt connected to we call them key business objectives. So the KBOs were rolled top down, this is what we need to do, but from bottom up, how do we get it done? And that was part of the process. And it was that employee engagement. And it's also the crucial conversations with the employee when they're not hitting their goals or when they're not giving their voice. You need to, as a manager, get their voice heard and bring it to the table. And not firing people or having a reaction to people if they're bringing bad news. People, again, they didn't want to report bad news. The big companies or the little companies. It was like, don't give me the bad news. But I like bad news because I'm going to fix a problem now rather than in the future when it has an impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one last thing, I think, which is this idea of team dynamic and the blend of people. I'm sure having pulled several teams together over the years, probably dozens by now, are there character types, phenotypes? How do you do it? Because I'm sure patterns across the teams that you've built and the ones that have been more successful and others that have struggled.
I think the best teams really have a combination of people types. The people that are more difficult to put together, but they have that balance of your hard drivers, but you can't have a team of all hard drivers. You need to have different characteristics. I think good teams start with recruitment and requirements. So what's the requirements first? What are the requirements? What do I need on the team? And what do I need in the individual positions? Lombridge has 67 skills or competencies that they talk about. So we use the Lombridge cards to really identify what are the skills, the characteristics that we need, then making sure we were bringing those types of people on the team, and then using the team model to just, why am I here and how do I manage through? And again, you got to have the managerial courage to address those people who are not delivering to the team requirements, if it's that. And I think it comes through good interviewing skills, teaching good interviewing skills and having that. When I went to Synergeye, no, people didn't know how to interview. They interviewed people, they'd ask a few questions, but they didn't know what the answers meant. There again, I used the behavioral interviewing skill, which is EARL, the EARL technique, and that's dig in, find out what their experience is relative to the job that you're looking for. The A is for action. What actions did they specifically take? What results did they get? And what was their learning? And just following that process, you would uncover more of the characteristics of the individual. You get less to their traits. You get more to the answers of how they got their job done and would that be a good fit. So I learned EARL at BD and we taught EARL at SynergEyes.
And I couldn't agree more. Obviously, doing the job that I do in the world, it's that great teams start with great people.
Yeah,
blending them, facilitating them. That is the job of the top leader, and getting that. Even young consultants coming through and things like that I've taught over the years, and we always call it multi-tier questioning, right?
Yeah.
And listen for the answer, go again, and you see the story shift sometimes 180 degrees. And very critical. Bob, I got to be honest, I think this is excellent, right? In terms of thinking about career development, enabling people to be intentional about it. It does sound that mentors have played a great role in your career and maybe given belief when you weren't sure where it was, but then opened the doors. But you have to step through those doors and embrace the fact that you've got to do a lot of learning along the way, which continues to carry forward. Is there anything else that you want to add, Grid?
Well, just to reinforce, I think we talked a lot about me and my career and how I manage things, but I also think being a mentor, I was mentored, and being a mentor there was so many people in my career that would sit down with me and talked about their aspirations and seeing some of the successes that they've had, some that have stayed within BD, some that have moved on to other companies and had great success that I felt a part of their development in their earlier stages. And we didn't have much movement at SynergEyes at the time I was there, but I think I'd moved people from complacent, just do the job, to being more actively engaged in leading the company was where I felt my mentoring had success in that company in my last gig. But just that as a closing comment, I don't know. Yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of different things, and it starts from the top, and it's a commitment, and it's follow through.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, Bob, is look, this stuff doesn't happen overnight.
No.
I think that's something which is also can be lost and sometimes has been lost with the newer generations, right? Where they want to be the CEO
tomorrow and you want to jump ship. But I also think that's where that development piece comes in. When you mentor somebody and you're developing them and you're putting time into them, they're less likely to leave. And at BD, clearly, the reason they had so much tenure, at least the time I was there, they just were about the people and developing them, and people saw that, and they never compensated. People could leave BD and make more money someplace else, but if they stayed the long haul, they would really get the benefits of that development, the enhancement of their skills, and their monetary results were probably very good as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. Look, I have to say thank you very much for taking the time today, I think, to share some of your wisdom. If people are open or would like to reach out to you or things like that, hopefully it's okay for them to connect with you on LinkedIn or...
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, reach me through LinkedIn. Absolutely.
Great stuff. But from my side, I'm just going to say thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity and talking with you. I've enjoyed, the last conversation and this conversation as well.